Welcome back to the show. This is Phil Vischer. This is the Phil Vischer Podcast. The show is brought to you by you, our listeners and our viewers. Do we have readers? We don't have readers.
Nope.
We have readers.
Actually,
what do they read?
Sky's blog.
They read my stuff. They read your stuff.
Yeah, okay. We'll call them readers. And our readers that support the show on Patreon. Patreon.com/Phil Vischer. So that we can pay the two guys standing back there, one of whom is an unpaid intern, but will pretend that he's getting paid, and the other one that is getting paid to make the show, and also market the show and make it so gosh darn wonderful. So thanks for supporting the show. A bunch of you signed up last week, and we really appreciate it. And we're starting to do our live chats, we think, if we can figure out how.
And we got that pilot episode of the new
movie proposal podcast
right.
is up, and behind the scenes stuff is up on the Patreon page. Exclusive behind the scenes footage.
And is that available to $5 a month subscribers?
Yes,
correct?
that's for $5 a month subscribers, right. And the live chats are for $10 a month subscribers, and the back rubs from Sky are for the $100 a month subscribers if they pass the clearance test, the background
and
check.
the hygiene test.
And the hygiene check. He don't touch hairy backs.
Except my own.
Did I clap? I have to clap so we can sync up the sound. Hey, it's a podcast. What do you know? Hey, it's a podcast. And we got video. Hey, it's a podcast. So lend an ear. The Phil Vischer Podcast starts right here. Oh, we'll talk to Sky.
Hello.
And Christian, too.
Hi, Phil.
Hi. And we've got a guest. His name is Matt, and he's here for you.
Woohoo.
Hi. Hi. Hey, it's a podcast, so lend an ear. The Phil Vischer Podcast starts right here. The Phil Vischer Podcast starts right here. Okay, how was your week?
My week was awesome.
Did you go to any birthday parties?
I was about to say the highlight of my week.
Did you go to any birthday parties?
Was this fantastic 50th birthday party of this longtime friend of mine that I still feel is 30.
Yeah.
But
like you.
He's not.
Like you. You feel you're like 32, right?
I do feel like I'm 32, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to face the fact that
you too
I will be 50 shortly.
Are tumbling across the 50-yard line.
I'm going to join your club.
Thank you.
Happy birthday, my friend.
Thank you.
Thanks for boldly showing me how to do it with class.
And Sky was also at the big party.
I was at the big party.
Yeah.
And you should know that Phil wore an inflatable crown.
I did.
And
I did.
I thought you were just going to wear that as people were coming to greet them. But no, you kept it on the whole night.
Sport.
Pretty much the whole night.
It went with his Wild Thing shirt.
I was wearing my Max from Where the Wild Things Are t-shirt, and he's wearing a crown on that, so it fit. Now, Sky, you think he's a party animal. You assume he's a party animal.
Oh, yeah.
He spent most of the party sitting off to the side with our pastor talking about books.
No, we didn't just talk about books.
He talked with me for a long time.
Really? About books?
Well, you kept cornering me.
I know, I did.
About books?
I kept tracking him down.
With theology?
I did because I have just bought all of John Walton's books, all of Phyllis Tickle's books, and so I've started reading through those, of course, and the Old Testament. And it's the only time I could capture him to ask some really deep questions. So thank you for being patient with me.
Sure.
This podcast is just not long enough.
It's just not long enough. But we had 40, 45 people.
It was so fun.
Quite a few kids.
Couple dogs.
More
than two,
Quite a few kids. Our puppy Keena wiped out 2 children.
Oh, no.
Including the pastor's youngest child.
Uh-oh.
So,
She was wearing a red sweatshirt, though. She kind of had it coming.
And she was running from him.
In fact, she watches this podcast sometimes. Hi, Eden. I hope you're okay.
Hi, Eden. Sorry, my dog took you out.
I told her she was like a bullfighter with a red flag, or what's it called?
It happens.
Red cape.
Cape. Yes.
Now, Matt,
sorry.
you were not invited to the party.
It's okay.
Sorry, Matt.
It's because I didn't know you yet.
It's a good reason.
And I feel like if I knew then what I know about you now, that of course I would have invited you.
That's very, very
And I would have spent my time between cornering you and cornering Sky because I have a lot to talk to you about, too. I'm really glad you're here.
Okay, who's Matt? Who is Matt Soerens, and how did he get here on the podcast?
Good question.
What's your title? Do you have a title?
Yeah, I'm the U.S. Director of Church Mobilization for World Relief.
Whoa.
What does that mean?
Whoa.
That means basically, so our mission at World Relief is to empower local churches to serve the vulnerable, and we do that overseas, but we also do so here in the United States. And my job is to help our staff and all of our approximately 25 offices around the United States to make sure that we are working well with local churches. We're equipping them to serve vulnerable folks in their communities, particularly refugees and other immigrants.
Okay, and the reason we've got Matt on the show is Matt has written a new book with two other guys, Stephen Bauman and Isam Smear?
Yep.
Smear?
He once told me he was going to run for Congress and it'd be a smear campaign.
That's awesome.
I'm holding up the book if you're watching on video. The book is called Seeking Refuge. It is put out by Moody Publishers and World Relief working together. On the Shores of the Global Refugee Crisis is the subtitle. So we're talking about refugees. Global refugees only?
Matt's a refugee from Wisconsin.
Whoa.
Doesn't meet the legal definition. but
North
yeah.
of the
What
Cheddar
is the
Curtain.
legal definition?
Legally, please.
Yes.
Tell
So
us.
legally, both under U.S. law and international law, a refugee is someone who has fled their country of origin because of a fear or well-founded fear of persecution on account of their race, their religion, their political opinion, their national origin, or their social group.
So if you flee Wisconsin because you don't like the Packers,
So on one hand, same country. So right there, I'm internally displaced, and
Okay.
arguably that was not persecution. Though Packer fans have very strong opinions.
That reasonable fear would apply there.
but if you fled north instead of south,
You could make the case.
then maybe.
So I do have one quick question. I mean, how real is this global refugee
Wait
crisis?
a minute.
Oh, sorry.
Back up.
Okay.
We want to hear Matt's story first.
Let me hear your story, Matt.
Sure.
Tell us your story. Where did you grow up? How did you get here? Why are you what you are?
Sure. So I grew up, as you said, in Wisconsin, about 3.5 hours north of Chicago, and refugees, immigration were not a topic I thought much about at all. To the extent that I did think about it, was what I heard on the radio, on television, what got forwarded to me in an email. Probably mostly a perspective that those people are a problem. They're an economic problem. Maybe a few of them are terrorists. That was probably the extent of my thinking on this topic. And then I came down here to the Chicago area. I went to Wheaton College outside of Chicago. And while a college student, a friend basically asked me if I would volunteer with her with this Rwandan refugee family that she was serving through World Relief DuPage. And they had 5 kids. She was really close to the 4 daughters, but felt like it would be helpful to have a male figure who was helped their, I think probably at the time, maybe 12-year-old boy. So I signed up for that and became really good friends with that family. When I finished college, I moved into their neighborhood, which was an apartment complex in a relatively wealthy suburb, but with like 25 different countries of origin represented in that apartment complex, many of whom were refugees that World Relief had helped to resettle in partnership with local churches. And that became a huge part of my life. Started working with World Relief, and my background with World Relief is in legal services, so working on immigration legal issues. And probably the last 5 years I've been at World Relief, I've been there about 10 now, my focus has been in one way or another working with local churches and denominations and other partners who have a lot of questions about immigration issues broadly, and especially in the last year about refugees in particular.
Right. Okay. World Relief background. When did it start? Why?
It started in 1944 as the humanitarian arm of the National Association of Evangelicals. So actually Park Street Church in Boston, in the midst of the last greatest refugee crisis of our time, right after World War II, said, what could we do to help? And so members of that church said, we're going to fast and pray, and we're going to use some of the funds we would have spent on meals to help relief and reconstruction efforts in Europe after World War II. So they got a bunch of other churches connected through the National Association of Evangelicals together, and that became, at the time, War Relief, and eventually that became World Relief, and our mission broadened not just to refugee crises, but empowering churches all over the world to serve vulnerable populations.
Okay. Since the late 1970s, World Relief has been one of fewer than a dozen national agencies and the only distinctly evangelical organization authorized by the U.S. State Department to resettle refugees within the United States. World Relief has helped to welcome more than 275,000 refugees into our nation.
So we should be
lot.
blaming you.
We are one part of the process for refugees arriving in this
I thought you were
country.
going to say problem.
Well, it does speak to the climate we're in this year, where you mentioned earlier, for the years you've been working with World Relief, there was some controversy about illegal immigration, but resettling of refugees was sort of a bipartisan, universally affirmed part of your work, but in the last year that's changed.
When I was in high school, it was Cambodian refugees.
Right.
Well, I remember
and
that.
we had a lot of Cambodian refugees
forgot about
move into
that.
Wheaton, into my church. I had people in my church who took in Cambodian refugees, and their stories were astonishing. You know, because they had escaped the killing fields. You know, it was really some horrific stuff.
And I think it's because of those stories that until probably September of last year, refugees were not necessarily widely understood, but the people who did have an opinion about them, it was largely sympathetic, at least.
Right.
And politically, I mean...
And it was a good thing to help them.
Yeah, it was
broadly considered.
Very patriotic. Give me, you're tired, you're poor, your teeming masses yearning to breathe free, right off the Statue of Liberty.
Say that again real slow. I mean, we ought to really listen to that. Say that
Give
again.
me, you're tired, you're poor, your teeming masses yearning to breathe free. The
as long as they're
refuse.
European.
Well, and certainly that history has never been...
Originally, Western European.
Right.
Or Northern European.
Yeah.
And then European, and, you know.
It's never been exactly there's always been a mixed reaction to immigrants in the United States.
Really? Always?
Oh, yeah.
Even way back when?
Oh,
Yeah,
Benjamin-
the Indians were not happy when you guys first showed up.
That's a good point.
And then the Dutch were not happy when the English showed
Right.
up.
Benjamin Franklin once said that the Germans arriving in Pennsylvania could no more acquire our language and complexion, our being British, I guess, than they could acquire our skin tone, our complexion.
Really?
Which to me is hilarious because I couldn't look at these
What's the difference
a bunch
between
of
a
nice white
German-
people and say who's British and who's German. But for Mr. Franklin, that was such a chasm. It was never going to be overcome.
Wow.
And we've had basically the same rhetoric about every subsequent group of immigrants who's come since.
Yeah.
Some people have. And there's
Are there
always been
any
some others saying we're
immigrants
ready to welcome them.
that we absolutely loved,
It's a great question.
other than the Swedish bikini team of the 1980s?
I'm sure that there is no group that has been universally loved.
Or the Cuban baseball players that escaped here.
Cuban baseball players.
And
We tend to
probably
like
like
those. Right? Unless you lose
But
your
team
job.
you're on.
Unless you have to play to
Unless you
against
lose
them,
your
but-
job.
What about
because of one.
Balky? Remember him?
Balky from
Perfect Strangers.
From Perfect Strangers.
Yeah,
Whatever
okay.
fictional country he was from, I bet we would have warmly embraced him.
Given that I think he was the only resident of that fictional country.
That's right.
What about Borat?
I don't think
He's
he
from
was welcomed.
Kazakhstan.
Kazakhstan. That's a real place.
Right, which they were not thrilled with
Right.
when that movie came out with.
Right. Okay. So, what you are saying is and what the premise of the book is, there is a fairly unprecedented refugee crisis going on today.
There are more forcibly displaced people in the world today, about 65 million. We just have new data out real recently, than at any time in recorded history, which is
That's nuts.
it's really. I mean, that's hard to put
Yeah.
numbers are hard to work
Do
with.
we know
but
how many refugees, how many displaced people there were after World War II?
We don't have perfect data on that.
Okay.
So there's a little bit of debate around how many it was exactly. But certainly since World War II, this is the largest crisis, and possibly it surpasses World War II.
So are we talking about roughly like 10 million?
65 million.
No. I'm saying after
just said
World
it.
War.
Oh.
After World War II. I'm just trying to get the perspective of the difference.
We
you
don't know.
We basically don't know. There's a pretty broad range of
broad
disagreement
range.
on exactly how many people were displaced. And it's also important to know there are people who are legally refugees who've left their country. So that's about 20 million people right now. And then you've got another 40 million roughly who are internally displaced. So they've fled their homes, but they're still within the boundaries of their country.
Okay.
So that's, for example, in Syria, there's around 7 million people who are internally displaced, and then another roughly 5 million who are now refugees, mostly in Turkey or Jordan or Lebanon.
If you're a refugee, are you considered an illegal immigrant, or because you're a refugee and not just somebody coming over, you're not an illegal?
It's all in the depends on who you're asking the questions to. The United Nations would probably, if they designate you as a refugee, they've interviewed you, they've determined you meet this legal definition. That gives you some standing maybe under international law. But it's up to the country that you've gone to if they're going to recognize that or not. So we have refugees who the United States has chosen to resettle. Burmese refugees, for example, who've gone to Malaysia, where they live in fear of the local police in Kuala Lumpur. Once they're here, they have lawful status because we think they meet that legal definition of a refugee. In large part, they fled persecution because they're Christians in most cases. But when they're in that second country, it's up to the second country if they're going to view them as, yes, you have legal status, or you have, we're going to tolerate your presence, but you're not allowed to work. That's actually the most common situation. It's sort of you're here, we're not going to deport you. In a few cases, people are afraid of deportation. But in very few cases are those people granted work authorization. So you can't support yourself. You're basically reliant on some sort of, either on the informal economy and or on some sort of humanitarian aid. to eat, to support yourself.
Okay, so why the book? Why did people say, hey, we need to write a book now?
I think we've long felt at World Relief that the arrival of refugees is actually an incredibly wonderful opportunity for the church in the United States, as well as in the Middle East, where we're active there, in Europe. And we want to spread that message that we think the church needs to be at the center of the solution to the global refugee crisis. Because it gives us an opportunity to live out the many commands in Scripture to love and to welcome refugees. It's also an opportunity to stand with the persecuted church. I think people sometimes lose the fact that when we're in the U.S. context of refugees resettled to the United States in the last 10 years, more have been Christians than of any other religion. So we have the opportunity to welcome those who have been kicked out of their own countries because of following Jesus. And it's also a missional opportunity for the minority who are not, or those who are not yet Christians. We have the opportunity to love them as we believe Jesus would, to welcome them, and as we have opportunities is to give the reason for the hope that we have.
So we don't have to send missionaries much. We can just wait here and have them come to us.
I mean, I don't want to say we don't need to send missionaries,
I
but
know, I'm
certainly
being facetious.
The nations are in our own community, and I think we're missing something very profound if we haven't noticed that. And most people who are listening to you are not going to be going overseas, but most of them probably do have refugees and other immigrants in their community.
Right.
And many of them, it's important to know, are already believers and might, you can share the gospel with them and they might share the gospel right back at you, maybe in some profound ways that we need to hear. I mean, my Karen Burmese neighbors who were persecuted for their faith, frankly, have a lot to teach me about what it means to follow Jesus.
Okay, so why'd you write the book?
We wrote the book because, especially right now, we know that actually most Christians in this country probably don't have that perspective. And that's really our audience for this book is evangelical Christians in particular. Evangelical Christians, according to there's some recent polling, are probably amongst the most likely groups of people to not want more refugees to resettle in the United States.
Really?
Why is a good question, and the data doesn't necessarily get to that. But anecdotally, I would say there's a lot of fear. Right now, I think a lot of Americans in general, but this certainly applies to many Christians. They hear refugee and they think Middle Eastern, Muslim, male, maybe terrorist. I mean, that's what we've been trained by some politicians to think when we hear about refugees. There's all sorts of reasons that's not a fair stereotype. And most of the refugees who've been resettled to the United States are not from the Middle East. 40% of those who are from the Middle East are Christians, so it's slightly majority Muslim, but a lot of religious minorities as well. But more importantly, we're thinking about this as a political issue, and I think most Christians, and again, we have data for this. Lifeway Research did some really helpful polling on this a couple of years ago on Christians' views of immigrants and immigration. Only 12% of evangelical Christians in the United States said that their views of refugees and other immigrants are primarily influenced by the Bible. In fact, the Bible, the local church, and national Christian leaders came in combined lower than the media. And we actually think that's a problem, that if we're people who would say the Bible is our authority for all of life, those numbers are really low. So our goal is to help
within the American church, what are the different attitudes that you see? That's you're the outreach guy.
Yeah.
What do you bump into? Is there a range, or is it just a couple of buckets?
There absolutely is a range, and I should mention first that we have tons of local churches that are fantastic partners that are giving of their time more than anything, but also of their resources, of their church space, of putting together welcome kits to set up apartments for new refugees, who are giving very sacrificially to care for refugees, and that's actually very, very common. But it's still a pretty small percentage of the church in the United States as a whole. Lifeway's research found that only 8% of Protestant pastors in the U.S. said that they are actively serving refugees in their community. That leaves a lot of space for growth in my mind.
Right.
Now, among those who are not, a big part of that is refugees are not in every community. There are immigrants in every community, but refugees who meet that legal definition are not being resettled in every community. Even in communities where they are, I expect there's many churches who don't know that, and part of that is, we need to do a better job as World Relief and the other resettlement agencies of reaching out to local churches. But I think a major factor is, of all the important good things a church can do, very biblical things a church can do, refugees right now are probably the most controversial. So let's care for orphans or for, something a little bit easier rather than jump into something that is going to upset half of my congregation.
So based on the statistic you just shared, 8% are actively engaged. That was before it became politicized. So now I imagine it's even harder.
That was in January, so it was
Okay.
after.
So, but still, 8% is
So
pretty
things
low.
really changed last year.
And honestly, I would say I'm not aware of a church partner that we've lost at World Relief, given the changing
Right.
political climate. Like,
But
in
gaining
fact-
new ones is going to be that much harder.
Yeah, I mean, we've had some new churches, in part because I think for a lot of people, they never had heard of a refugee until some political, candidates started talking about it. But so we have seen some new interest from churches, but we've also we've had a lot of requests from pastors saying, we're committed to this, we're going to help, we want to keep helping refugees. Can you help me help my congregation understand why this is important? So that's part of why we've written the book, to be a resource. Why is this biblical? Then we'll kind of pivot and say, we should do this even if it's scary. Like if you look at the Good Samaritan, he had some legitimate risks involved.
Right.
But actually this isn't that scary. Like here's the facts about refugee resettlement.
Okay.
No one resettled as a refugee in the United States in a 30+ year history has ever committed an act of terrorism in the United States. You would think that was
But
I
aren't
thought-
they all about to?
Well, wait a second. I thought, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong. And again, I think that I can certainly be lumped in with people that might get distracted by misinformation. But I thought that I had heard there were Syrian refugees that were jihadists that had gotten sort of through the net.
definitely not into the United States.
Really?
First of all, there's been very, very few Syrian refugees brought into the United States, and that's because it's a very lengthy screening process. Since 2011, when the war in Syria began, there's been less than 4,000 Syrian refugees admitted to the United States across the whole of the country.
Yeah, but some people hear 4,000 and go, "Oh my gosh, that's 4,000 terrorists that are here."
And the significant majority of those have been women or children under the age of 15, and that's in part because the U.S.'s criteria for choosing those who will be resettled. I mean, they're not going to resettle the vast majority of 5 million refugees, or 4,000 out of 5 million. So they can be very, very picky, and their criteria are to take those who are most vulnerable. So we have a lot of female-headed households, for example, and that's true not just with Syrians, but among refugees as a whole. But yeah, we've only had 4,000 is actually a very small number of Syrian refugees out of the total. But of those who have come to the United States, I'm not aware of any sort of incidents.
But we don't do any kind of screening. We just let them in randomly. And
I've heard that too.
Going to kill us all.
The reality is the process for screening refugees, and this is true for those of Syria and any other country of origin, this is at the point that they are referred to the United States for consideration for resettlement, usually by the United Nations, although we do some things unilaterally. That process then begins. It usually takes at least 18 months in most cases, sometimes much, much longer. Involves background checks, biometric checks, retina scans now. It involves the U.S. Departments of Homeland Security, State, Defense, and the FBI and National Counterterrorism Center. It is the most thorough screening that any category of immigrant or visitor who comes to the United States goes through. And I mean, last year there was about 70 million people who came into the United States, mostly tourists. Now, they are all subjected to some minimal level of screening, but there's no reason that a potential terrorist would be dumb enough to try to go through an 18-month screening process rather than trying to get a tourist visa. Not to mention, a refugee doesn't get to say, I want to go to the United States. They apply to the United Nations and say, I'm fleeing persecution, or I have a credible fear of persecution. And then the UN they refer them. Most of them never get referred for resettlement at all. Less than 1% of refugees get resettled to any other country. But among those who do get resettled, they might send them to the United States. If the United States screens them and accepts them, they might send them to Canada, which is taking far more Syrian refugees than we are. They might send them to Sweden or to Finland or to Australia or any number of other countries. So even if you had this secret plan, and I have no doubt that ISIS wants to do harm to the United States, but they could probably find a lot easier ways to get to the United States than going through the refugee resettlement screening process.
So pardon my ignorance, but in my imagination, as I hear certain people talk about this refugee crisis, I am imagining in my ignorance all of these people in Syria or these other countries where all this war is, all of these people just leaving and rushing to some shore and getting on some boat or running across some border in these mass herds and just getting in. And so you're telling me that that's not really how it works.
I mean, there are countries in the world where that is much closer to the reality, and that's something like what Europe is experiencing right now.
Right.
But the United States, because we have an ocean between us and most of these conflict zones, has a very, very different process. It's much more orderly, it's much slower, and we're talking about a far smaller number of people. I mean, Europe received more than 1 million individuals who applied for asylum last year, and that's the distinction. They weren't designated as refugees abroad and then they brought them in. They showed up.
Right. When I was in Italy, that's what they were telling me, that they've just run across the borders and they're just here and we have no idea what to do with them.
And that's, I mean, I'm a big proponent of the church as an opportunity in Europe, and I was in Germany a few weeks ago and heard that from German Christians, that they're seeing people come to Christ, they're seeing this as an opportunity. But it's a very different dynamic than the United States, where it's people who are identified abroad, selected, screened. Again, there's plenty of refugees in the world that the United States government could choose from, and they admitted last year 70,000 total from all countries. And again, a very small portion of those were from Syria. The more were from Burma than from any other country. So that's.
But isn't it possible for them to get legitimized, like over there? Just get a passport and then get on a plane and come to America?
Well, I suppose, but you got to remember.
Laugh at me.
Probably not.
I'm laughing at Sky.
Because I'm trying to figure out how to respond to this, but even the recent attacks, the one in Orlando, the one in San Bernardino, these were not refugees. They were not even immigrants. These were people who were children of immigrants who were born in the United States.
The wife of the San Bernardino guy.
Yes, the wife was, but the guy wasn't, and the guy in Orlando was a U.S.-born citizen. So cracking down on these refugees who legitimately need help out of fear of homegrown terrorism or terrorism on the homeland, it's apples and oranges. They're not. There's no evidence that a refugee has ever perpetrated, as you said, any of these attacks, and yet it seems to be the number one thing people are wanting to shut down because of their fear.
Well, how do you make a distinction between we need to stop accepting Muslim immigrants versus stop accepting Syrian refugees? That's a different thing.
Well, and are immigrants, and I feel like, are we talking about apples and oranges with refugees and with immigrants?
So refugees are a subset of immigrants, the way that like Baptists are a subset of Christians, right? So refugees are immigrants because they're people who have moved from one country to another.
By the way, we don't believe Baptists are Christians on the show.
I was going to say Baptists are Christians.
That is not
all
true.
Baptists are
Phil
Christians,
is
but not all
lying.
Christians
Don't
are
believe him.
It was my birthday. I get to say something outrageous.
So refugees are a subset of immigrants. They are particularly defined because they have fled persecution or credible fear of persecution.
Right.
So there's lots of other people who have fled poverty and very, the first book we wrote was on immigration more generally, and it's, we think that there's an important place for the church to play there. And the more complex questions of, well, what about those who are here unlawfully? How do we respond to that as Christians?
So being concerned about Syrian refugees and then saying we should get rid of all Muslim immigrants is kind of like saying we're concerned about bananas, so let's ban fruit.
I mean, they are a very small
That's a
subset.
good analogy, Phil.
Thank you.
They're a very, very small subset of all Muslim immigrants.
Sky
didn't agree?
No, I was
that
just
says he does not like
all I know
my
is we went from
analogy.
apples and oranges to bananas and fruit.
Yeah, the apples and oranges thing has been overused, and for some people
really
it just
has.
goes right, whoof, they don't even hear it anymore. It's become meaningless.
No, but
apples and oranges,
that
apples and
makes
oranges,
sense.
blah, blah, blah.
Bananas are the problem.
and fruit.
And fruit,
Subset.
we're trying to ban.
We're talking about subsets,
Right.
Sky.
I get it.
Do you know what a subset is?
I do.
Okay, good.
So yes,
Bananas.
the answer
After
to
I'm
that is
upset,
yes.
I get subset.
I'm lost on the question.
Okay, so the question is, welcome to my world.
What was your question?
Okay, no, it was yours.
Oh, my question.
And it
My
was
question.
yes, and it was. Is this refugee versus immigrant crisis the same as saying, because this banana is a
I think he already said yes.
well, that's what I'm asking. I'm confirming this.
So Syrian refugees are a very, very, very small part of all potential immigrants to the United
Are
States.
you willing to, as a representative of World Relief, endorse my banana analogy?
I think so, if I understood it correctly.
Okay, fantastic. Fantastic.
But I, to be clear, we don't think we should be banning Syrian refugees.
Or
we think
fruit.
we should or fruit. Fruit if it needs to be screened for diseases or whatever. No,
Right.
I'm
Right, you
turning
never
into
know.
metaphors.
Yeah,
It's
don't
not real.
You never know. So, I had a good question. Does creating that confusion, saying, whoa, we better shut down fruit, does that cloud the issue for having a useful discussion about refugees in your experience?
I think right now it's harder to have a useful discussion about refugees than it has been at any time in the decade I've been working with refugee issues. On the one hand, there's this, maybe a silver lining to that, in that people are asking good questions. That, most Americans could not have told you the difference between a refugee and an immigrant. Still, most Americans couldn't. But they couldn't have 5 years ago. They may have not known there was a distinction. And again, I don't set those up as distinctions to say, well, these are the good, sympathetic immigrants, and these are the, the other category of immigrants. We feel very strongly that those biblical injunctions to love and welcome the foreigner in the land apply to both. But for legal purposes, there's some very important distinctions. So people are concerned about these refugees who are here illegally. In the United States, that doesn't make any sense. Because if you are designated as a refugee, you've come through, you've been screened by the federal government, you were granted legal status the moment you arrived. And you were met at the airport by World Relief or Catholic Charities or another resettlement group. For us at World Relief, hopefully alongside a local church who was there to welcome you. We call that a good neighbor team. And we want our goal, and we don't hit this everywhere, but is to have a team from a local church connected to every refugee family that's arriving, who's going to welcome them, who's going to help them adjust to life in this country, who's going to help them understand some of the cultural dynamics and help them learn English and all those dynamics.
Okay, so here's my question. I'm thinking about a pastor who might be in our audience listening to you, who is sympathetic to the biblical mandate that we care for the orphan, the widow, the refugee, the sojourner, all that, wants to be engaged, but is concerned about how his or her call on their congregation to be engaged will be received, given the fear and hysteria and the political climate. What do you recommend to a church leader as they begin to address this? How do they begin to drain the fear out of their community and present a different vision for refugee engagement?
Yeah, and that's a huge part of my job and what I do with colleagues around the country. I would say there's 3 elements that we found are really helpful to change the culture within the church on this topic. One is to ground ourselves in Scripture. And we already talked about statistics that we cannot presume that most people in our congregations have a biblical perspective on this. So one way we've done that is we've worked with other partners to form something called the Evangelical Immigration Table that basically we have a bookmark. So it's called the I Was a Stranger Challenge. That's 40 Bible passages that relate in one way or another to the topic of immigration. And we found that's a really useful tool. It's not political. It's not vote for this party or that. It's just read these 40 Bible verses, maybe one every day for 40 days.
Yeah, but that's kind of a backhanded way of saying your political ideology isn't entirely Christian. Actually read the Bible.
That's basically what we're saying.
Yeah, and people, I've recently there's a very ugly little thing going on my Facebook page right now where people are upset with me because of a video I produced last week in which I had the gall to say that Jesus wants us to love our Muslim neighbors. And it's been kind of shocking to me to see the response to that. How many people claiming Christian identity are saying, well, Jesus didn't really mean that because these people want to kill us. And then you say, well, he also said love your enemies, right? And they don't want to hear that either. So it's almost willfully ignorant of what Jesus commanded because they want to hold to their prejudice or their political ideology. So saying,
or their idolatry of safety, I might add.
Yes, there's a lot of that going on. So it's a wonderful thing to say, read these 40 Bible verses, but I'm kind of discouraged, honestly, to see how many Christians don't care what the Bible says because they just are so afraid.
First of all, I would say we're not going to persuade everybody, and I've resigned myself to that a long time ago.
Well,
and
you should just resign from your job.
It only takes 4 or 5 people with multiple Facebook accounts to make themselves seem really disgruntled.
Yeah.
But the second thing I would say, so we need to ground ourselves in Scripture. I never presume that's going to be sufficient. Theologically, maybe yes, but not for actually persuading. Not practically. So then we go to the facts. Things like, let's look at the record of the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program. Let's look at the economics of refugees and talk to some economists and find out, actually, most economists think that immigrants in general, and this would probably apply to refugees as well, though there's less research there, are actually really good for the U.S. economy.
Well, that's just blasphemy now.
They're bringing a lot to the economy in terms of consumption. Eventually, they pay taxes initially, but they don't earn very much. But eventually, Sergey Brin was a refugee from the former Soviet Union. He went and started Google. He didn't take somebody's job. He created tens of thousands.
Wait. He was a refugee?
A refugee. Came in through the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society.
The guy who started Google was a refugee.
Co-founder, yeah.
Co-founder.
So you never know what you're going to get with these refugees. There's a lot of potential contributions in terms of employment and a product that most of us have used in the last 10 minutes.
So we're worried that we're going to get shot and we actually get Gmail instead.
That might be true.
Okay.
So then the third thing I would say is there's no substitute for putting a face on these huge statistics. So, I mean, our World Relief offices do events all the time where we'll ask one of the refugees whom we've resettled, hey, would you be willing to share your story, on a Sunday morning or in a special event? We've done videos that tell those stories as well.
Stop right there. Where are those videos?
So worldrelief.org. There are all sorts of resources. A couple new videos, actually. One, a refugee that was resettled to Canada. It's easier to find Syrian refugee stories who were resettled to Canada right now than the United States.
An American who resettled to Canada. There could be some of those coming along.
Yeah, I think I want to resettle to Canada.
But there's also stories of, World Relief is also active in the Middle East. So we're partnering with churches in Jordan, churches and other partners in Jordan and Turkey, in Iraq. And so we have videos about that too, how the church is responding there. Our response isn't bring them all here. We're saying we should serve people where they're at. But when some have to come here, how do we help them?
Right. So, okay, let's get practical. Because I'm just me. I look at the refugee crisis and I say, I can't do much of anything, and I've got enough to worry about with my kids and my dog and,
I'm turning 50.
And turning 50, I'm lucky to be able to sit up straight. What can I actually do? What do you say to local congregations that they can actually do that seems like it matters?
Yeah, I would say there's a handful of things. One, for those who do have a little bit of time, probably the most useful thing we could do is have, get a group of people from your church and be a good neighbor team, which probably is asking you for, visit that family one time per week for the first several months.
And how do you do that?
So we don't have World Relief offices everywhere, unfortunately, but like here in suburban Chicago, it's World Relief DuPage. If you go to worldrelief.org and click on the U.S., you'll see all of our offices there, and there's somebody in each of those offices who would be thrilled to help you as a church or even as individuals. So we'll do individual volunteer
opportunities. Does it have to be working directly with a person? Is there an app? Is there an app for that?
Can I bypass the human contact, please?
I know.
Basically,
millennials are uncomfortable with people.
They're going to be uncomfortable when they meet the refugee family, too.
Are there refugee apps?
Our church has been doing it for decades with World Relief, and there are people who...
That's because it's a missionary alliance church.
It is.
It's a CMA church, which had something to do with the founding of World Relief.
Beyond the people who are directly relating to the refugee families, there's a whole bunch of others in our church who have contributed indirectly.
Yeah.
By getting supplies or whatever. There's a bazillion ways a church can rally, and if you're uncomfortable being the person who is meeting them at the airport and going once a week to visit them in their home, if that's not your calling or your gifts, there's other ways you can help.
There's what we call welcome kits, which is basically you put together all the stuff that we need to furnish an apartment. There's cash donations. Frankly, we always need that, and that's true in the U.S., but also internationally. We have what we call Unlock Hope that we talk about on our website.
You also talk about in the book trying to support Christian churches abroad that are actually just swamped, with refugees, where we have 10 churches and then one refugee family shows up and we think, oh no, who's going to help them find an apartment? They have one church and
1,000.
10,000 refugees. How can we help them?
Well, that's a great question. We put together something at World Relief we call Unlock Hope, and you can find out about that at worldrelief.org. But basically, it will tell you here's basically it's financial contributions to World Relief that allows us to support local churches in places like Jordan and other organizations. It's more complicated in some countries than others in terms of how we can operate, but it allows us to serve refugees who are coming and internally displaced people as well.
What are you guys doing in Jordan, and how can we help with that?
So in Jordan, we're doing something we call child-friendly spaces. A very high percentage of refugees are children, and the sad reality is most of them are not going back to Syria anytime soon, and most of them are not in school. So they're missing out. Their lives are just passing by. So we've come alongside local churches to say we want to provide a safe space for kids to have some academic content, just a fun place for them to be safe and hang out and experience some of their childhood, which has sadly been robbed from many of them.
And watch VeggieTales.
I would recommend that. I'll have to confirm if that's part of the content.
Or what's in the Bible.
Or what's in the Bible, or what's in the Bible.
Galaxy.
I have at least one neighbor whose parents are refugees who came to Christ through VeggieTales. So
really?
As probably 10 or 15 years ago.
Now they worship produce.
That's why we're glad you're here. So, that was a good one, Sky. I want to high five you
including
too.
bananas.
Initially, they thought it was a cooking show, but they came around.
Can I get real honest?
Yeah.
Uh-oh.
I know we're in trouble
Maybe
now.
I should let people know you better decide if you're real honest.
I don't think you're the one to make that call.
That's true.
Thank
Okay,
you.
boys, can I get real honest?
I guess.
Okay, so I read the first chapter of your book, and I told you this earlier, but I decided I need to admit this publicly. I realized after reading that first chapter of your book that I probably was a lot more prejudiced than I had thought. And the reason that is the case is because I don't think of myself as a prejudiced person. I'm kind and loving and see people and I want to welcome them and I'm friendly. But if I get right down to the brass tacks and I'm honest about it, I am very uncomfortable around others that are different colors or that smell different or that don't speak my language or that, have different ways to raise their kids. And I prefer to stay around my people. And, and that goes as far to I don't want to have doctors that aren't American and speak English and that look like me. And so that's my innate, response and reaction. And I realize intellectually and value-wise, that's not what I believe, because I do believe what the Bible says, and I've read what it says about how we are to treat outsiders. But it's one thing to intellectually know that, and it's another, and accept it, and it's another thing to actually voluntarily live and act differently. And so, the question of what do we do or how do we help? I mean, honestly, I need to reshape my thinking just as one little individual, and I need to open up myself to actually meeting a human person and not just donating money that is a refugee from somewhere else, I think, because if I were to do that and I saw them standing there face to face in their need, that compassion probably would overtake my fear or my uncomfortability just because I think Christ is living in me. Am I on to something? I mean,
I would.
Yeah.
I think that's. I mean, first of all, I think that's a very common sentiment, and I know that's where I was before this was my work full time as well. For me, it was those relationships with just a few people that really made me rethink how I think about this topic, and also to realize that not only are these people who have a lot of needs, that's true, but they have a ton of assets as well. I mean, the refugees who make this country are incredibly resilient. If I was in the situation that many of my refugee friends have been in, I would have just rolled over and died. I would have. I would not have had the ability to keep moving forward. The grit, yeah. And I think there's a remarkable
maybe we can
resilience.
look at refugees as a grit injection for America.
And I mean, you mentioned earlier the Cambodians, several decades ago, or the Vietnamese were around the same time. You look at the Vietnamese American population in the United States today, who are largely descended from refugees or refugees themselves. They're doing better economically than American citizens as a whole.
how do you know that?
There's studies on this.
Yeah.
We cite them in the book.
Really?
Yeah, higher likelihood of being a business owner, higher likelihood of being a homeowner, higher likelihood of having a college education.
That's
and that's one thing people don't
statistic.
realize, and I was telling this to you earlier, Christian, is especially with refugees, but immigrants in general, but with refugees, those who make it to the United States, because the process is so selective, they tend to be the most determined, the most resilient, the most grit, and they end up doing really, really well in this country. And I don't know if you've just, even if you don't know them personally, but you just spend a little bit of time in the public schools and you watch some of these kids who are refugees, who have been resettled. And imagine yourself at 8, 9 years old being thrown to the other side of the world into a country where you don't know the culture, you don't speak the language, you don't look the same as these people. And you are either going to completely collapse under that kind of pressure as a little kid, or you are going to learn an enormous amount of grit. And that ends up paying off dividends for decades to come when they end up
As adults.
As adults. And that's what this country was built on. So in many ways, I look at those folks and go, I'm the same way. If you pick me up today as a 40-year-old and threw me on the other side of the world, I wouldn't be able to do it.
Right.
And yet these people have just an indomitable spirit in
It does
how
seem
they
that
overcome
we
things.
need, because as Americans, we have such a relatively secure standard of living. Relatively secure. We don't have to worry about a ton. As Americans, and you almost need a generational influx of people who haven't been softened by that. And I'm even thinking about, because we've talked about The church that Sky and I go to is just merged with a Korean congregation, second-generation immigrant Korean congregation. And one of the things we're having to work out is if we combine the youth groups or not. And the biggest issue is what night of the week they would meet on, because American kids won't meet on the weekend because they're giving up a night of a party or of football. And the Korean, second-generation Korean immigrant kids won't meet on a weeknight because they're giving up a night of homework. You know, and it's this conflict. What would you want to? No, I can't lose homework time. Versus, no, I can't lose party time. You say, okay, we need more immigrants every now and then to remind us how we actually made America great in the first place. Ooh, did I pull that around or what? Okay. So remind us again. Well, how do we get the book?
So you can get the book at seekingrefugebook.com. There's links to order it there. You can pre-order
or Amazon or a bookstore near me.
Basically any bookstore.
Seekingrefuge.com.
Seekingrefugebook.com.
Book.com. Seekingrefugebook.com. I messed it up. And to learn more, worldrelief.org.
Worldrelief.org.
Worldrelief.org. And what if they want to take you out for coffee and thank you for everything?
Yeah, look me up on Twitter. It's Matthew Soerens.
Okay, cool. Now I have to summarize.
But you have to do it in a refugee accent.
Heck no, Sky.
You could sing it in an Indian one, which would be super funny.
Super offensive. We don't offend people on the show, Sky.
Never.
I don't know if you've learned that. I don't know if you've even been paying attention, but we go out of our way not to offend.
Not? Did you say not?
Yes.
Just checking.
Hey, Matt Soeren. He's the chief of Church Outreach at World Relief, and he's the one who's gonna help us preach how to help our neighbors, the refugees, to find food and clothing and plenty of cheese and some long pants to cover their knees in Chicago winters that aren't like Syria's. So thanks for coming. It's great to meet you. And now that we're gonna come and greet you at the O'Hare Airport, where you land in America, and we settle you in DuPage County with all the stuff we can gather as a bounty to show that Jesus will. He loves you too. All right, thanks for coming. Read the book, Seeking Refuge. Go to worldrelief.org and learn how you can be part of the solution.
And don't forget Patreon.
Oh, yeah, and support us on Patreon, or we'll be refugees to another podcast. Thanks for being here, Matt.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
See you next week.
Bye, everybody.
The Phil Fisher Podcast is produced by Phil Fisher Enterprises and recorded live at Jellyfish Lab Studios. This episode was edited by Jason Rugg and was fact-checked by absolutely no one. For more information, go to philfisher.com.